All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to kick off Solon. I've started a recording, so those who haven't joined yet, they can rewatch the recording if they are a little bit late. I'd just like a confirmation, please, if everybody can see my screen all right. Perfect. All right, welcome to the first Johannesburg meetup for the UiPath community. In today's session, we'll be looking at the UiPath RPA developer best practices. I'm hoping to keep the presentation relatively short so that we can have a bit of an open debate towards the end of the session, and that we can just get a feeling towards where everybody in the community is at the moment and where we can go and take this going forward. So to kick off today's session, an end-to-end solution is essentially the sum of all of its parts. That includes the requirement gathering, solution design, development, implementation, support, and also the reporting. As we know, UiPath exposes a variety of these tools that may be used differently and efficiently to navigate through this end-to-end solution or the process of obtaining an end-to-end solution. And each of these tools comes with their own tips, tricks, and best practice standards. During the session, I'm hoping to cover at least some of these. And hopefully in the future, we'll have a few more sessions where we can share the lessons that have been learned around some of these tools. UiPath have also released quite a lot of documentation around some of these projects and adhering to some of the standards that they've put forward. There are also a lot of advantages following best practices. So for example, if you decide that in your organization, you're going to have a standard or best form of practice, then you know that all solutions that are developed using that standard are easily maintainable, especially in teams where DevOps isn't really a way of doing things. So essentially what that means is that teams where developers are developing the projects aren't necessarily the same people operationally supporting those projects. So during the session, I hope to convey some of the tips and tricks that I use in my approach to automation and how I use this approach in a retrospective to adhere to best practices. Now, in an ideal world, each phase of the automation lifecycle can be handled in different ways by different stakeholders. But realistically, in many cases, an end-to-end solution is generally handled by one developer, sometimes more if we're lucky, especially in cases where organizations are still trying to establish some sort of RPA ecosystem. So my focus on this session or during the session is going to be more on a perspective of a single developer trying to execute each step of the lifecycle. My name is Jackie Miller. I'm an automation architect at Dimension Data. I'm also doing my master's in computer science, and I am a blogger. So the things that I generally blog about are more in line with data and automation topics. And some of the things that I focus on are how to use platforms like UiPath, .NET Core, Python, SQL Server, and the Microsoft Power Platform. So in today's session, I'm hoping to go through some of the points that we want to consider when looking at gathering requirements, some things we want to consider when we're designing solutions, standards that we want to look at when we're developing solutions, and then the holistic approach to presenting the value that a solution adds to an organization. Now, the approach to automation can be broken up in many different steps or phases as one goes along the journey. And some of the things that I like to break different components up into include the requirements gathering phase, the design, the development, implementation, and then reporting. Now, operational support, in my mind, is generally kind of put together with implementation. Now, the one big question that I have when I look at this retrospective approach is generally how can this be made dynamic and reusable? The more dynamic and reusable solutions are, the more we can take those components that we basically just built and plug them into other solutions, which make the development process a lot easier. Now, if we look at the requirements gathering portion of a solution, there are a few questions that I tend to want to answer before I get started. One of those are what requirements were gathered or are going to be gathered. Has a PDD properly been filled out? In many cases where a PDD hasn't been filled out and the requirements haven't been gathered, it generally isn't a great idea to start automating because scope creep can become very real. It's important to know as well that documentation can be lean and comprehensive at the same time. So as long as you've got all of your business logic and your business rules summarized in a document, you've got enough to at least narrow down your scope. In many cases, being handed a task capture solution with elaborate business rules is more than enough to at least speed up the process. With that being said, the next question that I like to ask is what tools were used to gather these requirements? Has something like task capture been used, or process mining or task mining or something along those lines? Do I have access to the recorded process, and is there a video available? And in this video, does the user actually execute the process? Then I like to look at whether there are expected changes to the process, and essentially this will result in one of two things. The first one is that the process will be stopped completely, or the project will be stopped completely until all changes have been made. And the second is you narrow down those changes to a specific phase or a specific part of that process and only address that later on once the changes have been implemented. So you can still keep developing the rest of the solution. And then the fourth one is, are the other steps that I've used in other processes? So is there logic in a different process that I need to be cognizant of? Is there something that I can reuse? Or is there potential for me to take this and reuse it in another solution going forward? Now, still on requirements gathering, one of the tools that I've mentioned was task capture. Now, task capture is a really nice tool that allows you to capture what the user has done, and the result thereof is then a process flow with screenshots attached. This can then be exported to either a PDD Word document or a UiPath XAML solution. Generally, what we tend to do as well is just save the solution as a whole and then later on break it up into the two different components, the documents and then the workflow, if you want to call it that. Some of the good practices that you can look at to try and fast track this whole process include being able to, as far as possible, record what the user is actually doing, record the user steps, add screenshots, make sure that you name the process steps quite intuitively so that when you export the solution and you open it up in UiPath, that all the sequences are named nicely and you know exactly what's happening. As you can see, this is then the output of those two options. The one on the left is the UiPath XAML file, and the one on the right is then the PDD. The PDD includes the screenshots within the process steps. It also includes a whole bunch of statistics about how long it took, what keys were sent, so on and so forth. So some of the points that can be made looking at task capture is that when you name process steps appropriately, it helps a lot when you're trying to basically output your PDD or even create the basic template of the workflow. If you had to run this workflow inside of UiPath, it should execute exactly what was done within the recording or within the task capture, which also helps at least start breaking up the solution into different parts. Using task capture definitely speeds up the requirements gathering process as well as the development process due to its ease of use and its user friendliness. Other tools that can be used during the requirements gathering phase are also the UiPath process mining and the UiPath task mining tools. The next portion, or the next phase, if you want to call it that, is solution design. And here we tend to look at things like, has the solution been split up into different phases? How can the solution be split up into different phases? What are the logical steps that need to be split up first before breaking them up into conceptual steps? How should the solution be designed to align with whatever design pattern was chosen, if a design pattern was chosen? The next one is, what tools do I need to design for? So am I going to use a database? Am I going to use UiPath apps? Am I going to look at document understanding? And then what are the best practices that are associated to each of these tools? The next is, can I reuse other components from other solutions? So this would include things like libraries or even old XAML files or different XAML files that you have in different processes. Also, this might include something that you have within your own organization. So if you've got a reporting module or you have a telemetry module or a login module or something like that that you use within your organization, this is essentially where you'd start listing those. And then the last one in this section is, what configuration or telemetry do I need to store? So this is two parts to it. The first one is config, and then the other one is telemetry or logging. So some of the questions that we tend to ask here is, where will the telemetry and configuration be stored? Is the configuration accessible to users or stakeholders? So if a change needed to be made or the config parameters needed to be changed, does it require a whole new redeploy? Can we do it in some way where we don't need to redeploy? And can other people do it, or do our operational developers operational team, do they need to do it? We also want to understand whether this solution is going to be dynamic and reusable. And do I need to be able to report on the configuration and the telemetry that make up the solution? If reporting does need to be done, how will it be done? I'm going to touch on that a little bit further in the presentation as well. So in a nutshell, we get to design patterns, and a design pattern can be described as a template or format that is used to structure code in order to solve a problem in a systematic way. So design patterns are generally used to assist in creating solutions that support object-oriented programming, which essentially just means that your solution is modular and reusable. So you can take pieces out, put new pieces in without having to rebuild an entire solution. Design patterns can also be used to maintain consistency across solutions so that multiple developers have a very clear understanding of how the solution flows from one end to the next. It is also very important to keep design principles like solid in mind, especially when trying to decide which design patterns to use and if a design pattern should be used. In cases where projects are literally as simple as I'm getting my data and I'm writing it to a file and that's that. You don't really want to add the extra complexity of a massive design pattern. So there is a place for it and there also isn't. So when working with RPA solutions, it's also important to remember that a solution is assumed to have a short lifespan, which can go or range anything between 6 to 24 months before facing reevaluation or audits. Once the value of an RPA solution is reevaluated, certain aspects may need to be changed or enhanced or upgraded. In doing so, or in using a design pattern, it is a lot easier to accommodate for those changes in the foreseeable future. Now, okay, let me just go back one step. So essentially what would happen, this is an example of how you'd break up your different activities within the solution into a design pattern or through the use of a design pattern. So essentially you'd have different layers. Some of these could include your initialization, data access, business logic, your helpers, your tests, and your output. In doing so, what you're trying to do or what you're hoping to do is group the different activities or the different functions that you have in one single layer so that if something needs to be replaced, you're just taking that function out and you're replacing it with something else. If we take an example, let's say we've got an Excel file that contains stock information and it's storing its information onto a SQL server, an on-premise SQL server. The solution has been reevaluated, let's say after 12 months, and the audit has found that new scanners will be used for stock taking rather than manual files being updated and Excel spreadsheets being uploaded to the ether. The automation, therefore, then needs to be enhanced so that the sensor data is accepted straight from the scanner instead of reading all the Excel files. If all the logic that connects to Excel files is referenced in multiple different sequences or workflows, and it lived all over the place, enhancing that solution would create some havoc. So by having just a normal data access layer, if you access the data from the Excel file in one place, and that was then how you sent the data through the rest of the solution from that single point of entry, all you would do is change that single point of entry to then accept the scanner data, and the rest of the process would work seamlessly, well, hopefully seamlessly. I have written a blog post on this and essentially the pros and cons of using design patterns, and that's accessible through the QR code that is currently at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Next, we move over to solution development. This also comes with its own set of questions. The first being, what should the project structure look like according to the design? And this talks to or relates to what we were just discussing or looking at with the design pattern. Is there a design pattern that is going to be used? Which design pattern is going to be used? What does it look like? What do we need in order to break the project up, and what does that structure look like? The next is figuring out whether queues are required. So in many cases, the use of queues will determine whether you need a dispatcher and a performer, if you need a single project, sorry. And also when you're looking at queues, you also want to understand what kind of queues you need to cater for. What information will be stored in the queues, and essentially how will you access those queues? Where will you access those queues? Then you want to look at what components of the solution can be transformed into reusable libraries. And here you want to understand how can you make this dynamic enough to be able to reuse in the future. So you don't just want to be able to use things from old solutions that you built, you also want to be able to create reusable components for the future as well. Then you want to know what information is absolutely necessary to be hard-coded. It is good practice in any software design or software development environment to hard code as little information as possible. Rather use config files or tables in databases or something like that, because when you ensure that the code is dynamic as possible, you're essentially making the solution robust for the future. Then the next portion that we look at here is some of the UiPath standards that already exist. Now, these are broken into two separate components. So if you're looking at the UiPath Studio, UiPath proposes the different naming rules and the design rules that you can also use the analyze workflow function within UiPath Studio to evaluate. So I've summarized these in a table or into two different tables. These are the design rules. And those are something that we generally should stay cognizant of when we're using Studio. Then the next portion is the implementation and support. Once again, more questions that we need to consider and answer when we're looking at the implementation portion of a solution. And this would be, when should a process be audited? When should we reevaluate whether this process needs to be decommissioned or enhanced? Like I mentioned, RPA is intended to be a short-term solution, which means that it should be used for as long as necessary or for a certain period of time before being reevaluated and seeing if this is actually necessary. Then how would I go about enhancing the process? If, for example, additional parameters needed to be catered for or needed to be added, how would that affect the process? Would it be easy to implement, or would I need to enhance the solution and build a whole new arm for that project? Then another thing that I'd always want to do is make sure that my environments are in sync. So I'd always want my development, my QA and production orchestrators to be in sync. The database table structure should also always be in sync. Source control, published versions, all those kinds of things should be in sync as far as possible. Then the next one is, do I have or do I need a disaster recovery plan? In the case of an environmental failure, is there a way that I can continue running the processes, or do I need an alternative plan of action? What is that alternative plan of action? Do I just need to communicate to my stakeholders to tell them that everything's down and we'll let them know when it's back up again? Or are we going to take proactive measures to get something in place that allows us to take care of this? Now, UiPath has multiple different disaster recovery architectures that they present. So this is essentially one of the architectures. This is the active and passive architecture. And the whole idea behind disaster recovery is to ensure that as soon as there's a disaster, you can keep running. It is a very important aspect when you're looking at a mature RPA ecosystem that runs a large number of processes, especially if those processes are business processes that affect a large amount of users. Then the last portion or the last part of the life cycle that I usually look at is the reporting portion. So what value does the solution that I am about to build add? Can I show what the actual realized time saving is? Can I report on what the successes and failures are? Can I report on the exceptions? What are my kind of exceptions? What define those kinds of exceptions, and so on. Then I also want to be able to look at what information is available for reporting. This also includes what information was gathered, collected, or generated through the process, and how should that be visualized. This kind of links into the last one as well. So who will consume the report? Who is the target audience, and does that impact how it will be visualized? Then to jump to the third point, or the third question, what tool or tools should be used for reporting? Can the orchestrator be used? Is that simple enough? Do I need a Power BI report? Do I need an Excel spreadsheet? Can I just send a normal Teams message? Do I need to send an email? So on. These are two separate examples of those kinds of reporting. So we've got the holistic view of exactly what's happening, what the how many processes we have, how many libraries we have, so on and so forth, and then also what the queue progress was or success failure rate was. Those are pretty much the points that I have. What I would like to do is discuss what other kinds of questions or approaches people in the community have towards RPA, especially when we look at best practices. Do we have any takers? Anyone with questions or comments?
Hey Jackie, Khalil here. How's it going?
Good, thanks to yourself, Khalil.
Good, thanks. So my question isn't necessarily around developing. Being a pre-sales engineer, I generally don't do implementations. But what is your best practices around deploying your solutions?
So essentially what we've done is we've gotten a checklist together to ensure that all of our stakeholders are in constant communication. They know exactly where we are in the process. That checklist also ensures that we've got all of our steps listed. So for example, if we're using a database and all dev has been done on the dev database, one of the steps would be to migrate all of that over into production. Once that's done, deploy all of your project files into the dev orchestrator, create your queues, your triggers, all the stuff that you need there. Test it from the dev orchestrator, and once it's successful, only then can you publish to your QA and your prod orchestrators. So we've got, to answer your question in a very short fashion, the best way to do that would be to have a checklist where you're ensuring everything works on dev before you move it into production.
Awesome.
But you're looking for
Thanks
a little bit more
very
detail
much.
than that.
No, it was a very high level question. I just wanted to know if there were any, rules and regulations that you put into place, which you clearly have. So that goes a long way in making sure that from one project to another, you're consistent in that sort of deployment.
Yeah. I'm actually quite keen to know if there's a different way that somebody else in the community has potentially done it. Do we have any takers for that question?
Oh, there's a couple of questions already in chat, so.
Oh, maybe I should open that up. I first just need to figure out how to open up my chat. Oh, there we go. Okay, let me just expand this. Sorry, I didn't realize I had a chat function. Okay, so I've got one here that says, can you share a few best practices regarding libraries? Are you using the library project type? What about UI libraries created in object repository? Do you keep them all in orchestrator? Thanks. Yeah, so generally when we create libraries, we do use the library project type. It makes it a lot easier when you're trying to publish and just pull everything down from NuGet Package Manager. What we haven't done yet is try the object repository. Quite interested to see how that can enhance our environments as well. But yes, we do keep all of our libraries in the orchestrator. Orchestrator is technically because it should be in dev and prod for your solution to work. I see one from Emmanuel as well. What are you using for code review since you're using code best practices? So Emmanuel, to answer your question, the first thing that we do is make sure that if you go into UiPath Studio, there's a portion there that says analyze workflow, analyze project, validate project, so on and so forth. The first thing that I do when I do code review is click on that and make sure that there aren't any errors that pop up at the bottom to say that there are default names, that there are empty try catch blocks or empty catch blocks. So just looking at the normal UiPath standards for that. And then what I also like to do is go through the code and make sure that we're connecting to databases. We aren't using hard-coded connection strings or variables that aren't being used or removed. And then also just making sure that the flow of the sequences are in logical order. So that's more in terms of coding practices that UiPath put forward. That's more or less how I look at code review. That's a personal thing, though. I think there are different ways that different people would probably run a code review session. Okay, then I see one from Hari Kumar. What are the best practices in unattended automation using Orchestrator? So I think a lot of the stuff that I've spoken about in this presentation, some of the questions that I've had and some of the stuff that UiPath put forward themselves were based on unattended automations. We don't generally build attended automations for the simple reason of we want everything to run in the background on the orchestrator. So in terms of that question, pretty much everything that I've covered in the presentation is my answer. Can you please provide the recording link? I definitely will do, yes.
Hello, hi Jackie. Tushar Singh this side.
Sorry, I missed that. Please may you repeat?
Yeah, hi Jackie. Tushar Singh this side
Oh,
from
hi.
India.
How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you for
That's
asking.
good.
So, Jack, my question is, you stated that we should use reusable components like reusable XAMLs. So, how do you keep track of it? Supposedly, a different developer is there who's making use of other XAMLs. So, how do you have that, intershareability of that, and how do you document it, or what is the process in that?
So essentially, this would probably depend on what your source control strategy is as well. If you're using something like Azure DevOps and the developers have licenses, then any changes that are made to the XAML files are recorded in source control through Azure DevOps. Any comments and stuff that are made or any changes that are made need to be commented in the commit message. And generally, what another good practice would be when trying to document what that library does is ensuring that you've got a wiki set up, or if you're using something like Confluence, you've got a Confluence document set up that explains what the rough outline of the process should be. With the question that you had about the different XAML files and the different developers as well, if you're creating reusable components and it can be turned into a library, that is generally the better approach rather than having copied and pasted XAML files all over the place. Just publishing the library and then reusing that from there. So that also helps because if you make an update to that XAML file, you can just update the library in solution. You don't have to copy and paste the code over again.
Thank you. That answers my question and a very well insights. I must say that the presentation was really good.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Hello, Priyanka here.
Hi, Priyanka.
So I wanted to know, like, can you list some best practices for using document understanding model and also integration of UiPath apps with your bots? What kind of best practices that can be considered in these scenarios?
Okay, I only caught a
Because
few portions of the question. Would you mind maybe popping the question in the chat for me, please? I got a few parts of it. So I think you asked something along the lines of documents understanding UiPath apps and then the integration thereof.
all of these components bounded together. Let's say we have developed a code using UiPath document understanding model, and then we have published it over orchestrator, and then we are using it in our UiPath apps. So, what kind of best practices that needs to be considered for smooth functioning of RPA plus UiPath apps?
So I think the biggest component of being able to integrate the different UiPath tools is to make sure that you're following the same practices. So make sure that your naming conventions and your naming standards are more or less the same. Make sure that you're adding a lot of description and that whoever needs to read through your project, whether you're doing it in, let's say you're using just documents understanding or you're using just UiPath apps, maybe even the AI center, whatever you're using, make sure that you're following the same standards throughout, same naming conventions, so on. The challenge with those different or integrating those different tools is that each of them come with their own standards as well. So I think according to a development team that's going to work with this, it would be good to understand what would work best in all of those cases. So if you've got a different person working on your UiPath apps and you've got a different person working on your studio and then the third person possibly working on document understanding, it would be just a good idea to get a common baseline of what that naming convention would look like. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Are there any other questions? Okay, usually silence is golden. The other I think I have a question as well, geared towards the community. Are there any other best practices out there that you might be using within your organization, or that you might be using on your personal projects that you might feel is quite valuable for other people to know about?
So just a very quick thing I'd like to add. So when you're creating a project, we all know the existing templates, the REF, the orchestration processes, that sort of thing. What I think a lot of people may not be aware of just yet is that you can create your own templates within UiPath. So if your company has a specific way of doing something and it's based off a template, you can actually create that within UiPath and then disseminate that to all of your developers to make sure that you've got the base to work off, which is exactly the same for everyone. So something like document understanding, for example, you could create a base template for that based on the way you would want that to be done within your organization, and then just distribute that towards all of your developers. It's just something I think a lot of people aren't aware of yet.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Thanks, Khalil. Yeah, that template functionality, I think, can come in quite useful, especially like Neil mentioned as well, if you've got your own libraries that are a must, or different activities that are a must within your organization. Cool. Are there any other recommendations, comments, questions? All right, if there are no other comments or questions, okay, here we go. Here's one: using UiPath test suite testing phase. So this is an interesting one. Can be a good practice. Yep, definitely can. I think that is probably something. Yeah, sorry, Khalil, go for it.
Okay, so I'm actually the test suite SME for the MEA region, so I can expand on that if you'd like.
Yes,
basically,
please.
with our test suite, so with our test suite, it's not just for testing your RPA workflows, it's also doing your application testing. And a number of our customers, particularly in Europe and the US, they've already started using our test suite just for application testing while they're getting their automation journey off the ground, which means that as they start bringing RPA into their organization, it's easy enough to start testing pretty much immediately by using test suite. So yes, it would be a really good practice to test your automations with test suite. And if possible, to also test your applications using test suite. A lot of organizations already have testing functionality. They use Selenium, they use Micro Focus, whatever. That's fine. I mean, by all means, use that to do your application testing, but you can't necessarily do RPA testing with that. And that's where test suite comes in. And if they don't already have an existing automated testing solution, if they're doing everything manually, then of course, test suite can do both the application and RPA testing. And we have made it exceptionally easy to generate test cases from your RPA workflows, as well as see your workflow coverage for your tests as well. So there's a lot of functionality built into test suite that integrates really well with the RPA side of UiPath. And as for the data-driven test cases, yes, data-driven is very much supported in multiple ways, from files, from data queues, from databases. You can just pump whatever data you need to into your test cases. It's a really good way of testing it.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Khalil.
No problem.
I think I'm actually quite curious. What would the support be for having a test suite theme for our next meetup. Is that something that more of you would like to know about or have a presentation about?
My answer to that is quite biased.
Well, yes, I'm thinking the same, because I think it might actually be quite an underrated portion of the UiPath product lifecycle.
Well, I can say there's a lot of interest in it. I've been doing a number of presentations lately, and people are keen on it. It's just in South Africa specifically, a lot of companies are still getting started with RPA. So getting a testing product for a non-existent RPA journey is a bit, yeah, doesn't really work at the moment. And South African companies tend to not want to initially invest in the test suite alone. So it's a weird place to be in, but there's a lot of interest in it.
Yeah, I guess, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because more people would want to first get their environment stable.
Exactly.
So I see Andrew's got a question as well. Is there anyone from the community that could potentially present their findings around the test suite? My immediate answer sounds like Khalil and Priyanka.
Do I count as part of the community?
Yes.
Look,
why
I
not?
can talk a lot about the technical details and the capabilities of Test Suite, but having not implemented it myself anywhere, not having, well, we only have 2 customers in South Africa, I believe, that have purchased it, and they're still implementing. So it's really hard to give feedback on that specifically. I could get use cases from other countries to present at some point, but it really depends on what sort of detail people are looking for on this.
So, Khalil, Andrew here. My question was maybe just to get it from a user perspective or from a client perspective to tell us what they found. And if Priyanka could probably potentially present to us in a future session, wouldn't mind you filling in gaps or filling in questions, etc. But would love to hear from the community as to how they find it, and so if there are cases out there. I know it's quite a new thing, and myself for one would love to see more about it, especially use cases in production.
Yes, I can present on mobile device automation as well, because I had used UiPath test suite for mobile device using Appium, but there I encountered one issue, like the connection between mobile device manager and the mobile device through Appium get disrupted frequently, so the test does not get executed sometimes. So that was the issue which I had encountered.
Okay, well, I think having you present would definitely be a better or a more impactful presentation rather than having me send the sales pitch out again. So thanks to both you and Andrew for talking about that. And yeah, maybe we can organize something like that.
Thank you so much, Priyanka and Khalil. Priyanka, I'll reach out to you after the session, and maybe we can set something up for the next session. Potentially for you to present the test suite and your findings.
And can you comment something like the best practices which have to be taken care regarding application level exceptions? Because some generic ways to deal with application level exceptions, which have to be followed just to get rid of application errors or such issues which are frequently encountered. Sometimes application is not being able to launch properly or API level issues. So what kind of best practices does the developer need to take care so that at least delay or downtime is minimized as far as possible? So do you have any suggestions for that?
I have a few yet. Oh yeah, sorry, Khalil, go for it.
Jackie. No, ladies first.
That's very sweet of you, but I think you should go first this time.
Right. So in that scenario, I think it's going to be entirely dependent on the requirements of the process and the project. For example, I've worked on some projects where there was no retry needed. If something failed, it was just ejected from the queue, end of story. Whereas there's some where it needs to be retried until it comes right. So you might need to do something where if you've got delays in your code, you might have to increase that delay after each retry. You might have a specific number of retries limited by the amount of time you have available to actually complete that process. The way you retry might have to be changed. You might retry during the entire process. You might retry during a portion of the process. But all exceptions do need to be handled, even if it's the most basic thing of realizing, okay, the process has failed, an exception has been thrown, I'm going to log this, and someone can look at it later. That's the most basic level. But to say also best practices around exception handling it's a bit too high level, I would say. It really does depend on the process and its requirements. Don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jackie.
More or less. I think my answer was going to be more geared towards it depends on which application you're experiencing the error with. So if you're using something like SAP, or you're using one of the older versions of SAP, that could potentially be an issue. So what you might want to look at doing is either upgrading SAP or upgrading your libraries. What I found as well often when I'm dealing with selectors, especially in browsers, if it was working and it's no longer working, first thing I do is check the version of the package that I'm currently using and if there's an upgrade available. Some of the other things that you can do, and this is part of the properties on some of the activities, is you can set the one property, I can't remember what it's called, I think it's in our interactive or it's underneath the target. But in essence, it's one of the UI elements. And when you click on the target, it allows you to wait for it to either be complete or incomplete or so on and so forth. So what I often do is I wait for the element to have completely loaded before I try to execute a click or a type int or something along those lines. So very much to the point that Camille made, it's very dependent on the application that you're experiencing the error with it as well. So there's a question here, will the recording of the session be available? Thank you, Andrea. Yes, it will be. Do we have any other questions, comments, any other points that anybody would like to raise? Andrea, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to add.
So just maybe one thing around application exceptions that we're currently dealing or starting to build is the ability to take every application exception and potentially log it as a ticket. And but before logging another ticket, so you don't span your ticketing system, is to check whether that ticket has already been logged. If it has already been logged, you update it with what you've seen again. So in other words, if you get 6 different application exceptions from the same process, then your ticket will be updated with all the different things that you've seen. You could potentially then include screenshots, etc. And that can be part of an application exception handling template almost. So when you see this error, log it, and then it doesn't slip through the cracks because it goes and sits in the ticketing system. You don't flood your ticketing system because you've allowed it to go and check whether it's already been logged. And yeah, then you kind of have a view as to what goes wrong in your environment, and potentially also then you can create knowledge bases, etc., that people can go and reference afterwards based on the application exceptions that you've seen. But I mean, that's just one thing that could be done around managing application exceptions.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you, Andrew. So the point that Andrew was making as well is to raise visibility in your organization about some of the errors that you're currently facing and how they need to be dealt with. I don't know if there are any questions for Andrew with regards to some of the information he's just given us.
a lot of lucky.
Yes, it does seem that way. Okay. Andrea, is there anything you'd like to add from your side?
Yes. Firstly, congratulations. I'm really happy to see all of you back together. So I'm Andrea. I'm the Regional Community Manager for EMEA. And we've had another meetup in Johannesburg, I think 1.5 years ago. It seems like it was another lifetime back then. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity again to bring you all together in a way. I didn't bring you together, actually, Jackie did, but I'm happy to see all of you in the same meetup, and I'm really happy for all the questions that you had and that you are interested in continuing this, and I am really honored to support anything that will follow after this. I just want to share a few small messages with you, and they are all related to your learning, because one of the objectives of meetups is to bring you all together to get to know each other, and also to be let's say a learning hub for all of you. Let me open up my camera so you can see a person talking. Let's see if it works. So we are looking into bringing more value for you, for your automation project and for your automation journey. So we have a survey, we have prepared it for you. You will also receive it in the follow-up email, but I want to share it also here in the chat box. We also have a new use case repository, and with this initiative, we want to build a repository of use cases that can help anyone in the automation community, including you. So we are not only looking for people to upload, you can see what use cases we have right now there. And of course, I would like to invite you to join DevCon on the 15th and 16th of June, biggest RPA conference that we are organizing, and I'm going to leave all of the links in the chat so you can access them right now. I'm not sure if you have any other questions or needs. I understand you already have a subject for the next meetup, which is great. So I guess if there aren't any other questions, Jackie, I can give it back to you to close the session.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your input, and thank you so much for assisting in getting this set up and connecting the community. I think we can definitely do more things if we're sharing knowledge, especially within our region. Thank you to everybody who joined and for your input, your questions, your comments. Khalil, thank you as well for your insight. It is much appreciated. And then I hope to see you all in the next session. Have a good one further.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.